In the early hours of a cold October morning in 1415, the world still believed in the invincibility of steel-clad nobility, kings ruled by divine right, nobles by ancient blood, and knights, towering figures encased in glittering plate armor, were the gods of the battlefield. Their swords were forged by master craftsmen, their steeds bred for war, and their honor believed to be unbreakable. The battlefield was their temple, and for centuries they had reigned as the unquestioned masters of war. But on this single damp morning beneath a merciless gray sky in northern France, all of that was about to collapse. On that field near a small village called Agincourt, the age of knights, centuries old, romanticized and glorified in song and legend, would die in the mud. Not by another army of equal splendor, not by genius strategy or superior armor, but by rain-soaked peasants pulling strings on simple wooden bows. And history would never forgive what happened there. Before dawn, the air was thick with the stink of wet soil and fear. A cold mist crawled across the grass like a living thing, clinging to every surface, dampening breath and chilling bone. The English soldiers, exhausted, hungry, many sick, stood silently, their armor battered, their clothes soaked with days of endless rain. They were not the glorious army England had promised. They were survivors of a brutal campaign, marching through hostile territory, ravaged by dysentery and near starvation. Their king, Henry V, a man young but carved hard by war and faith, stood among them, not glowing as a divine monarch, but pale, hollow-cheeked, and resolute. He had gambled everything, his crown, his life, his country's security, on this campaign. And now, trapped and outnumbered on French soil, he would be forced to witness whether fate favored his reckless courage, or would bury his name beneath the mud like so many nameless soldiers before him. Across the field, the French army glittered like a parade of gods. Tens of thousands strong, some 3 times the English number, fine banners waving, armor polished to mirror brightness, plumes dancing atop helmets, horses snorting steam into the cold morning air. They laughed, drank wine, and boasted under their breath. For them, this was no battle. It was a hunt. The English were already beaten, weakened from weeks of retreat, cornered with no escape. The French believed victory had already been written. Honor now demanded they savor the moment. It would be a glorious slaughter. Their chronicles would record it as divine punishment for English arrogance. They would crush Henry's ragged army beneath armored hooves and steel, drag the English king captive to Paris and parade him like a trophy. This day, they believed, would prove the eternal supremacy of knightly nobility. Yet there was something the French did not understand. Something ancient and quiet that lay waiting in the mud alongside the English. A weapon humble in appearance, older than these knights' shining ideals, silent yet capable of cutting down dreams. The longbow, 6 feet of English yew, carved by peasant hands, held by men who had trained since childhood, not noblemen, not warriors of chivalry and honor, but commoners hardened by hunger, toil, and necessity. Their fingers thick with calluses from a lifetime of drawing 120-pound bows. Their arms strong from practice that bent bone permanently out of shape. They were the backbone of England's war machine, invisible in royal portraits, forgotten in chivalric tales, yet terrifying in their mastery. They did not fight for glory or honor, but survival. And survival breeds a different kind of soldier, one who kills not to prove worth, but because the alternative is death. As dawn bled slowly across the sky, King Henry moved among his men, not from a distant throne or atop a glorious steed, but on foot, mud splashing around his boots, cloak soaked and heavy. He spoke softly, with words that carried not divine command but human grit. He reminded them that God was on their side, that England's cause was righteous, that courage was stronger than steel. Some believed him, many simply clung to his voice like drowning men clutching driftwood. A king who stands in the mud with you is not a king. He is a brother, and brothers die together, or they survive together. On the French side, nobles mounted their armored war horses, laughing as servants tightened straps and fastened visors. They viewed the English with disdain. How could such ragged shadows dare oppose them? They were knights, born into privilege, trained for war since childhood, wielding swords worth more than a peasant's lifetime of earnings. Their armor was nearly impenetrable, their horses massive and bred for crushing enemy lines. And above all, they believed in chivalry, in the righteous beauty of combat, in battle as a sacred art. The English archers, filthy peasants wielding sticks, insults not threats, The field itself was a silent conspirator. Narrow, funnel-shaped, bordered on both sides by dense tangled woodland that forced the French to compress into a tight mass. Days of rain had turned the ground into thick mud, a sucking heavy bog that gripped boots and hooves with greedy pull. The English, light-armored, prepared. The French, burdened in plate, ignored the earth beneath them, and soon that arrogance would drag them to their deaths. When the first English arrow flew, it broke more than the morning silence. It shattered an era. The sound was not glorious. It did not roar like cannons or clash like steel. It whispered, the soft hiss of feather against wind. But that whisper carried the death of centuries. Thousands of arrows rose into the sky like a dark storm cloud and then fell, not randomly, not wildly, but with cruel precision. The French laughed at first, believing their armor invincible, their shields strong. But laughter cannot deflect steel-tipped death falling from the heavens. Arrows hammered into plate, pierced chainmail, ripped through joints, smashed visors, shattered bones. Horses shrieked and crashed to the ground, skewered or terrified. Knights, noble, powerful, trained to fight men face to face, were suddenly reduced to prey, scrambling under a downpour they could not fight. The French cavalry charged as tradition dictated, as honor demanded. But tradition does not matter to physics, and honor holds no place in mud. The ground swallowed hooves, slowed momentum, dragged horses down. Arrows found gaps, eyes, throats, lungs. Riders fought their steeds, tried to spur them forward, but panic spread like plague. Horse after horse collapsed, crushing knights beneath. Steel that once protected now trapped them, drowning them in mud as they clawed helplessly, suffocating beneath their own pride. The second volley came, then a third, and soon the air was filled not with war cries but screams. Horses screaming, men screaming, the sound of metal hammering into bone. The archers worked with mechanical precision, faces emotionless, movements drilled into muscle memory. Draw, anchor, release, draw, anchor, release. Their fingers bled, arms strained, backs ached, but training had made them machines long before the battle began. They did not need courage. They needed repetition. The French infantry attempted to advance, but they waded into a slaughterhouse, packed so tightly they could barely raise weapons, slipping in mud slick with blood, stumbling over bodies of comrades and horses. The English archers, once their arrows thinned, did not retreat as knights expected. They dropped bows and rushed forward with knives, hammers, mallets, stakes, tools of farmers, woodcutters, hunters. They closed in on suffocating knights like wolves, swarming with merciless efficiency. Armor bent under blows, visors smashed, throats cut through gaps in steel. A nobleman raised from birth to believe in the purity of knightly battle found himself drowning face down in mud, trampled by peasants. His name would be lost, his legacy broken. No poem would save him. As the morning dragged on, something horrifying happened, something that marked the true death of chivalry. The French begged for mercy. Knights who once swore to protect honor and dignity lay screaming, trapped, broken. But mercy was not granted. Henry ordered enemy prisoners killed, a decision born from necessity and terror. The archers, covered in mud and blood, obeyed. It was not heroism. It was survival turned feral. The line between soldier and butcher blurred and then vanished. History, written by scholars far from the mud, would later dress this massacre in noble language. Tactical brilliance, military revolution, end of medieval warfare. But the truth is simpler, uglier. On that field, in that suffocating pit of chaos, a world died. The sacred image of the knight, shining, righteous, invincible, drowned in brown water and blood. The longbow, humble and silent, had stripped nobility of its myth. As the final bodies fell and screams faded into choking silence, the archers did not cheer. They simply breathed, heavy, ragged, trembling breaths, staring across a field where mountains of armored corpses lay twisted in unnatural angles. They had not out-honored the knights. They had out-killed them. Mud stuck to their boots, blood streaked their faces, knuckles raw, arms limp. They were men who would return home not as heroes of legend, but as ghosts carrying the weight of what they had done. Across the ruined field, Henry V looked not like a triumphant king, but a haunted man. Victory had been won, at a price carved into memory, not stone. Chivalry was dead. The old world lay in pieces, and in its place, a new, colder reality emerged. War belonged not to nobility, but to skill, discipline, and ruthless necessity. The bow had shattered the sword. The commoner had broken the knight. And history, once poetic and glorious, had become brutal and honest. The age of armor would never recover from Agincourt. Knights would still ride for centuries, but their invincibility was gone. The world now understood that courage and steel were no match for range, precision, and cold pragmatism. The battlefield belonged to arrows, later to bullets, and eventually to machines. But it began here, in a muddy field on a bleak October day, where peasants lifted bows and kings bowed to physics. The legend of the night did not end in a final duel. It suffocated in mud while archers loosed another volley. And as ravens circled overhead, beginning their slow descent, the world shifted forever. The field did not cleanse itself of horror when silence settled. Instead, it seemed to breathe, slow, heavy, and wet, as though the earth itself had swallowed too much blood and struggled now to digest it. Steam rose from the broken bodies of horses, mingling with the mist and mud, forming a haze that hung low and suffocating. The archers, their bows finally lowered, stood motionless like revenants. They had broken the knights, shattered them more completely than sword or fire ever could. Yet in that stillness, victory felt like a burden rather than triumph. What lay under their boots was not glory, it was consequence. War had always been dressed in poetry. Bards sang of shining armor, righteous battles, and noble deeds. Even in bloodshed, there were words to make dying seem meaningful: honor, valor, duty. But here, on this sodden field, such illusions evaporated. There was no poetry in the faces of men drowned in mud, helmets still sealed, arms frozen mid-struggle, as though begging the earth for mercy it never granted. No honor in the whimpers of knights suffocating beneath the weight of comrades and horses. No dignity, for the noble lineage ended in filth. The knightly world that once stood unchallenged did not fall with a proud clang of steel. It suffocated slowly, choking on the same mud peasants had trudged through their entire lives. For the archers, exhaustion now replaced adrenaline. Their arms trembled, fingers burned, drawn raw from bowstrings. Some placed hands upon knees, not from relief, but from the sudden realization that they had survived what should have killed them. Others stared blankly, eyes unfocused, spirits somewhere between prayer and numbness. A few wretched, not from sickness but from the weight of seeing human shapes twisted in grotesque forms, limbs bent backwards, bodies crushed under armor they once believed sacred. Their ears still rang with the sound of arrows striking steel, a deafening percussion of mortality, and with the wet crack of bones beneath mallets and knives. To kill from a distance was one thing. To close the gap and finish a knight gasping in his own helmet, that was something far darker. Yet survival rarely leaves room for remorse, and these archers were not knights. They were men of the soil, raised where justice came from a plow and hunger was a greater threat than steel. They had long understood that the world did not reward honor, only endurance. And today they endured. That was enough. Henry V remained still for a long moment. His face, carved clean by sweat and rain, bore the marks of fatigue that even kings could not escape. He had gambled everything, and fate or divine will had walked beside him, but victory sat uneasily on his shoulders. He had ordered prisoners killed. He had turned peasants into executioners. The burden was his as much as theirs. Leadership rarely grants clean hands. Only when he spoke did the English forces stir. His voice was not loud, nor triumphant. It simply carried, cutting through damp air like a thin, steady blade. There were instructions, orders to regroup, to tend to the wounded, to strip the fallen of valuable armor. For even victory demanded practicality. English soldiers moved forward, prying open dented helmets to confirm life or death, pulling rings and clasps, stripping plate armor worth fortunes. For some knights, this final violation, death followed by looting, was worse than being defeated. Their pride had always been their armor. Now even that was stolen piece by hands stained with mud. The French dead lay thickest where pride had burned brightest, around the trampled center, where the heaviest knights had thrust themselves forward believing raw power could crush discipline and patience. Their bodies overlapped in layers of steel and flesh. For many, the mud had been not just ground but grave. Those who had fallen face down had suffocated slowly. Breaths turned to sludge as their armor pinned them to their fate. Those on their backs had stared helplessly at the gray sky, eyes wide, watching ravens descend. Among the English, murmurs began, not prayers of thanks but disbelief. They had seen miracles dressed in horror. They had watched men as grand as statues fall like cattle. Some whispered that God himself had pushed the French into the mud. Others feared the battle had revealed something darker. Perhaps God did not choose sides. Perhaps the earth simply punished arrogance without needing divine instruction. The French survivors, those few who still clung to life, did so without dignity. Knights once proud enough to consider peasants beneath notice now cried out, voices muffled by helmets or choked by mud. But mercy was a luxury this battlefield had rejected. Englishmen walked past the pleading shapes, some delivering a swift end, others ignoring them altogether. In war, death becomes currency, pity bankrupts discipline, yet not all cruelty came from cold necessity. A few archers, their faces hardened by lives of little kindness, watched the flailing knights with grim satisfaction. For years these lords had taxed their lands, controlled their fate, wielded power with ease. Now the world had flipped. The mighty clawed helplessly at earth while peasants stood above them. In this moment, the social order cracked, not by philosophy, not by law, but by mud and arrows. The humiliation was complete. But victory, however absolute, does not end hunger or fatigue. The English were exhausted, starving, and still stranded deep in enemy territory. The field of triumph was also a prison of corpses, and their journey home remained uncertain, shadowed by danger. The longbow had shattered the night, but it could not conjure food or shelter. Survival was not guaranteed beyond this field.